We're going to go ahead and roll into our second section here. And first of all, this first thing is going to be familiar to you again if you were here for the sermon series, but this is the groundwork, framework thing, like, mental place that we need to be when we're thinking about having spiritual conversations with people, which is, and this is from, the sermon series, but if you weren't there, so what many of us operate on is what I call the binary model of people, which is to say that all people exist in one of two categories, or maybe one of four categories, because there's kind of two axes, but there's non-Christians and there's Christians, right? Those are the only meaningful categories, and our goal with people is if they're Christians, they're good. If they're non-Christians, we got to get them to become Christians, and that's the goal of a single spiritual conversation. Does that make sense? This is the wrong way of approaching it. And then some people might add sort of unchurched and churched as a second category. We need to get them, to have a church, right? And that is not helpful for a bunch of reasons. I'm not going to review everything we said there, but two of the reasons are, one is because it's not really that simple. I mean, biblically, we're called to make disciples, right? We're not just called to flip a switch for people. People are in process and struggling through things. And two, that approach can actually lead to a lot of what people think of as the stereotypically negative interactions that you have as Christians. And I alluded to this in the sermon, but I'm going to tell this story as a good example of why the binary model is problematic, why trying to just have spiritual conversations that only do one thing are problematic. And so in college, I'm still a little this way, but much more back then. I loved Jesus and did not at all culturally fit in the church, right? And, for various reasons, especially in younger college. So this is when I was 19, 20, just turned, I don't know. Anyway, the girl that I was sort of dating, and it was messy, and I was young, and I, had kind of officially broken up in a pretty cataclysmic way, right? And to picture me, I had long hair and wore camo jackets with punk rock band, things stitched onto it. I mean, Brad knew me when I was in college, and I was kind of a punk. And so I'm heartbroken and struggling, and so I bummed a pack of clove cigarettes off of a roommate of mine and went down by the fountain by the Union at UNL. This is at 11:30 at night, and was just smoking and staring at the water and thinking about how I hated the world and my heart was broken and, and all this stuff, right? And these two kids come up to me, and they are from they were from Alpha Omega, which is sort of this Christian frat house thing that was on campus at UNL and kind of was fundamentalist-y. And it was clear that they were out to do evangelistic presentations for people. And what preceded was a 40-minute long conversation in which I'm just look, guys, one, I am a Christian, and two, I am not, I do not want to have this conversation. Does that make sense? Given everything that was going on. But it was so clear to them, one, I didn't fit, their kind of categories of what a Christian was supposed to probably look like. And two, they really needed to have a conversation where they presented the gospel and tried to get me to pray a prayer. Does that make sense? And so I spent 40 minutes long trying to convince these guys. Anyway, and I always remember that, because they so clearly had this one simplistic roadmap, right? Of we have this conversation, we give this presentation, we get you to pray this prayer, and that's our goal. And it could not adapt to the reality of the situation that I was in that moment for a lot of reasons. And it was just, and anyway, I say all of that to say the issue with that was that if I wasn't a Christian, right? I'm pretty sure I would have been much more hostile to Christianity than if I was. And frankly, if I wasn't a Christian, having a conversation where they heard about what had just happened to me in terms of my love life, and does that make sense? And why I was kind of struggling, would have been way more spiritually beneficial than having this sort of simplistic attempt to flip the switch. So, binary model's bad. Instead, people exist in process, right? Both before and after. Actually, I wasn't going to do this, but both before they come to faith and after they come to faith. There's this really helpful, let me find this here, hold on. There's a really helpful chart that was in here, the angle scale of steps to Christ that they give, which is a way of saying that there's this process that people kind of go through in terms of their Christian walk. And he has 16 steps, starting with no awareness of God, some awareness of God, contact with Christians, interest in Jesus, investigating Jesus, grasp the truth about Jesus, understand implications of truth about Jesus, accept Christian truth, accept implications of becoming a Christian, decision to surrender to Jesus, gain confidence in that decision, experience change in their life, learn the basics of their faith, learn Christian disciplines, sharing faith with others, ongoing growth, right? And even that, each of those things is broken up into a lot of individual kind of steps and conversations and things that happen. Does that make sense? And something like that just fits. If you've ever, like it fits my life, right? It fits the people that I interact with. We recognize that people are in that. And so the question we're always trying to ask is, what does it look like to invite people to take the next step in their journey with Jesus in a given spiritual conversation, or a couple of steps? And sometimes that might mean them saying, man, I want to become a Christian. Sometimes there's never a clear moment of that for people, right? And it's kind of messy, and they're around the church, and then suddenly they're following Jesus, and you're like, wow, I don't know quite how this happened. But regardless, that process is normal. And I think it's really important to stress it's normal even for people like the Apostle Paul that we don't think about that as. It's very common for people with the binary model to use Paul as their example of that, right? Which is to say he's not a Christian, Damascus Road experience, light from heaven. He's a Christian and following Jesus. But his story isn't that simple. On the one hand, Paul grows up within Judaism. He grows up religious, right? And we would say, in one sense, he grows up churched or Christian, right? And is very observant, even though he hasn't really received Jesus. And then he has contact with Christians. He's there when Stephen gets martyred and preaches his sermon, right? And hears the gospel there. He's probably heard the gospel at other times as he's kind of interacted with Christians and persecuting them. Then the Damascus Road experience happens. Then he's brought into the city, and he has the gospel shared with him again. Then, before his ministry starts, he spends 3 years, it seems, kind of just learning about and kind of solidifying as a Christian before he goes out and kind of does his missionary journeys and stuff. There's this whole process that even Paul goes through. And he has a much more clear kind of moment of conversion than many of the characters that we see in the New Testament. So, all of that said, that idea is great. How do we actually figure out how to help people take the next step? And that is where this chart, I'm not going to try to replicate it up on the board, comes in. And I have to give a caveat here. So this chart is from that book. This is not a map of exactly what to say. And I know for some of us, we're like, oh my goodness, having a flow chart for a conversation feels really artificial. And it doesn't need to be artificial. But I found this so helpful when I encountered it. And so we're just going to walk through it step by step and ask the questions it asks and explain why it asks them. And the idea is this is kind of the mental process you walk through. So we are at the point where an opportunity comes up to have a spiritual conversation. Somebody says something to us that opens the door, or we kind of, open the door a little and they open it up, and we're kind of talking about spiritual things. So there's a couple of questions. The first one is, are they in crisis? What are some examples of crisis? You guys know this. Throw some out. Lost a job. What was? Divorce. Yeah, family member dies. Get a bad diagnosis, right? Some crisis arises. And I think this is an important place to start, actually. So, if they are in crisis, what the chart recommends and what I recommend is you listen to them, you comfort them, you maybe kind of make a plan to help show them care, and you offer to pray, and you don't try to have a conversation beyond that. And that seems weird to us because it is very common for Christians to have this idea that you're in crisis, this is the moment for me to get you to become a Christian. Does that make sense? Now it is true that crisis might be creating a situation in their life where over time they might come to follow Jesus. Does that make sense? But here's the thing. In the first place, in the moment, what that person needs is just comfort, right? Jesus is very telling when he encounters people that need comfort in the Gospels, where he just will be with them and comfort them, and he doesn't try to, he doesn't, when he invites the disciples to come follow him, it's not because their lives are falling apart in that moment, right? When he meets those people, he shows them love and care. And also just because decisions made in those moments of crisis actually don't usually have a great record of lasting. Not that they never do, but as someone who went through grief, I just remember people telling you, like, you need to, for a season, not make any major life decisions early on, right? Because you're in a place where you're not really thinking clearly about those decisions, where you're often just trying to feel better, and where you may well regret those decisions, or, you're kind of a different person in the middle of that crisis, right? And so, yeah. Now, if the person is really clearly wanting to process that stuff, maybe, you're being prayerful and discerning. But what you should not do is someone is tearfully like, I just found out that my wife's having an affair and she's going to leave me. And your response should not be, pray this prayer with me and come to church, right? Your response should be, I'm so sorry. Let me sit with you. Let me try to care in practical ways. And then at the end of every one of these, you'll notice ultimately offer to pray, right? You can still just say, can I pray with you for that? All right. And obviously out of that, right, if that's the conversation you have, keep caring, keep listening, follow up with them. And like I said, it may be that person, that's an important event in their life that causes them to re-examine where they're at with Jesus and stuff. But don't try to force that. Okay, second, is the person receptive? So, in some ways, you maybe have already determined some of this, but this is where you say, okay, we're starting to have this spiritual conversation. Is the person interested in having that conversation? Or am I just kind of pushing it? Am I just kind of forcing it? And if the answer to are they receptive is no, you still offer to pray for them, right? That's the thing you can always do. Although obviously if they say no, offer is an important word there, right? But you don't try to force it any more than that. The question I think that we can often have is that how do we know if the person's receptive, right? Especially because sometimes it's really obvious, but it's not always obvious. And this is a really complicated answer that I found is very effective, which is you ask them. Another book that I don't recommend to people, but that I read years ago, and that was very helpful to me, was this book called Permission-Based Evangelism, which was like permission-based sales, basically, but applied to evangelism, which is kind of why I hated it. But the basic idea is just like, what you can do is you can say, hey, like for me, this kind of connects with my spirituality. Is it okay if I share that, or would you rather not? And people will answer the question. And in fact, it's very common for me throughout a spiritual conversation with somebody to repeat, like, hey, like, are you cool with this? We don't have to keep talking about this if you don't want to. And far from like driving people away, that will actually usually make people feel more open to having the conversation because they feel safer in it, right? Because they are safer in it. You're not trying to force them to have a conversation. Can you guys think of other questions you could ask? Throw out one if you have one to see if someone's receptive. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. We'll leave it there. And then the third question, and this is the thing that kind of then determines the track of the conversation, is do they identify as a follower of Jesus? Do they identify as a follower of Jesus? Now, there's a reason that I am using that language. Does that make sense? Which is to say, a lot of people ask the question, are they a Christian? That's a complicated question, actually, for a few different reasons. In the first place, it's complicated. The biggest reason it's complicated is just because we live in a world where there are lots of people who would say, I'm a Christian, right? And what does that mean? That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? That can mean that I'm deeply invested in following Jesus. That can mean I grew up in the South, right? And so you want to ask, do they seem to be someone who's trying to follow Jesus? But it's also important to stress that the answer, if they say yes, right, do they identify as a follower of Jesus, you'll notice the arrow doesn't just go down to offer to pray with them. And the reason for that is when we're talking about spiritual conversations, part of why I like that language is because we're talking about conversations that you can have with someone who doesn't identify as a Christian or with someone who does. Kind of wherever they are on the spectrum, you and that person can have a good conversation about spiritual things. Does that make sense? So, and again, you might wonder how you know that, and often you'll just pick that up from talking to them. Also, you can always just ask them. We talked earlier, right, about that, like Don recommended, like just ask them what their religious views are. Or I mentioned that neighbor who's just like, oh, I'm not religious, and I'm like, okay, I know which track if we have a spiritual conversation that we'll be on as we talk through those things. All right, any questions about that before? Yeah. Well, again, that's why I'm saying, do they identify as a follower of Jesus? As you'll see in a minute, like, that doesn't necessarily distinguish it. But ultimately, I guess I didn't say this, ultimately part of the issue with that is that I don't get to see into people's hearts, right? And so I can know whether someone says they're a Christian or not, whether they says they follow Jesus or not. I can't, and at this point, you're not trying to sort of test and figure out whether they're really a Christian. You're just asking whether they identify as a Christian or not. So, let's then walk through those two tracks. So if they say no, right? That is what I think a lot of us think of as an evangelistic conversation, right? I'm using spiritual conversation to cover all of this. But we're saying, okay, like they're not a follower of Jesus. So whatever steps they're taking, whatever the next step looks like, it's moving them towards following Jesus. And so, first of all, you'll notice, by the way, I guess I didn't mention this chart, this is where it starts to matter, is split into knowing and then responding. And so that is to say, first you're trying to know, that's see, understand the person, right, before you kind of respond. And so if they don't identify as a follower of Jesus, first, keep building relationship with them, right, in that conversation and following conversations. That's what we talked about before. Secondly is identify barriers. Identify barriers to them engaging with Jesus, trying to get to know them and figure out what that are. So there are actually different kinds of barriers when we talk about that. The first, and this is the one I think we automatically think about, but it's real, is intellectual barriers. They have intellectual struggles that keep them from engaging with Christianity. Let's throw some of those out. What are some of the intellectual barriers that they might have? Problem of evil, yeah. Yeah, they don't know about Jesus or Christianity.
Maybe they've been burned by the church.
That's going to be a later barrier. So, but, and also off of don't know, they also might just have the wrong idea of what Christianity is. Like, the number one intellectual barrier for normal people in our world to Christianity is that they think that the message of Christianity is that you try to be a good person so that you get into heaven. Like, I regularly meet people who would say that's what Christianity is, right? That whether that's like you don't drink or whether that's, you go to, you do these things or religious stuff or be, nice to your neighbors or whatever. like, that's actually an intellectual barrier. Does that make sense? Now, obviously, it's good to be nice to your neighbor and stuff, but that's not, we like we would all say, that's not the gospel, right? That's not the foundation of Christianity. What else?
Would you classify underneath that the impact of scientific things like creation?
Sure.
Spiritual.
Scientific issues with miracles, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yep. So, second set of barriers, Brad, you'll see why, are emotional. So Brad said getting burned by the church. What are some other examples of emotional barriers? Yeah, an absent father that they feel like tells them something about God. What else? Yeah. You're angry at God. Yeah, I mean, it's the problem with people in suffering can be an intellectual thing, right? But it can also just be an emotional thing. Yeah. Yeah. Trauma, I mean, deep feelings of shame and guilt that keep you from, feeling like you could enter into the presence of God. There are lots of emotional barriers. Third is there are cultural and relational barriers. I have friends who do missions work in Japan. The number one thing that people in Japan will say, if you share the gospel with them for why they wouldn't be interested, is because none of their family is following, and especially in a culture that really values family, right? Like you're losing your family in essence to follow. I use Japan as an example because that's stronger, but obviously that our relational networks shape that, right? If somebody is deeply connected with, if all their friends aren't following Jesus, like there's a cost if they decide to start following Jesus there. Same culturally, right? We live in a culture that has certain values, and Christianity challenges some of those values, whether that's about wealth or whether that's about sex or whatever, the thing is, right? And there are people that's a barrier to that they feel like is there. And although this one feels a little different, there are just spiritual barriers that are in place with people engaging with Jesus. People's, hearts are hard and...
You put theological issues under that?
Oh, no, that's intellectual. By spiritual, I mean the fact that people's hearts are hard in sin and, Satan is that entity that works in the world and things like that. Like, there's just, even if you address these other things, there's a sort of spiritual struggle that we are engaged in. Theological stuff I would put under intellectual. So, anyone have any barriers we need to add besides those categories? Yeah. Yeah, that's part of why it's sort of both of those. Does that make sense? Like, in some ways, one of the interesting things is that weirdly, sorry, this is a side thing, but weirdly in our world, because of the Enlightenment and some other factors, we're conditioned to think of like Christianity and atheism as like the two positions that are in dialogue with each other for people, but it's way more complicated than that, right? And atheism wasn't really, I guess the Stoics, for some of them were atheists, but in the ancient world, you weren't trying to get your person to not be secular, right? You were trying to get them to stop like praying to Zeus and Apollo and to follow Jesus instead. And so, especially as the world becomes more religiously diverse, you have to recognize that an intellectual barrier could be that that the Bible's not trustworthy for like skeptical secular reasons, or it could be it's not trustworthy because it was corrupted and the Quran is the perfectly delivered final revelation of God, right? Those are both intellectual kind of ideas. And unfortunately, a lot of us as Christians, I think, have just been trained to only, if we're going to engage with them, we've only been trained to engage with like secularism, and that can be a challenge if you meet someone who's another faith tradition. And as a side note about that, if you find yourself in that situation from our earlier conversation, instead of trying to argue when you don't know what you're talking about, you know what the best thing to do is? Ask questions and listen to the answers and learn. Does that make sense? So if you have someone who's a Muslim or Hindu or whatever that you're interacting with, instead of trying to get in a big argument initially, build relationship, ask questions, maybe read a book or two, and then, you can reach a point where you can maybe engage more with that. Okay. Any other questions about that idea before we then talk about? Okay, so we identify, and so in a given spiritual conversation with someone who's not a follower of Jesus, we're talking with them, and what we're trying to do is identify some barrier that the Lord seems to have in play. Does that make sense? What's the thing we're talking about? What is the kind of barrier that's in play? Maybe it's intellectual, maybe it's emotional, maybe it's relational, whatever. Does that make sense? And once you feel like you have a sense of whatever barrier because again, those steps, what we're saying is that someone might have 20 different barriers, to following Jesus, right? And ultimately, even if you remove all these other ones, we have that ultimate spiritual barrier. The Holy Spirit has to move and change hearts, right? But what we're trying to say today, as I'm talking with you, is there a way I can kind of talk? Is there a barrier that I see? And then seek to address that barrier and share the gospel. That is kind of what you do. And by address the barrier, I don't necessarily mean like have all of the answers. Does that make sense? Especially because some of those barriers, like these barriers, like if someone was traumatized by cruel Christians in the past, right? That's very different to address than if somebody is wrestling with the cosmological proof for the existence of God, right? And unfortunately, I think maybe because a lot of us as Christians like apologetics because they make us feel right and that is good for our egos, we tend to see like what these apologists do in debates about the cosmological argument and try to apply them to all of these categories, and that is not a good thing to do. So, for example, let's say someone has this relational struggle of like, I don't know any Christians. Does that make sense? Or no. Of like all my friends, would think I'm weird if I kind of engaged with faith stuff, and I don't know, it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, let's say you think that's the barrier. You know how to address that is by trying to say, hey, let's hang out again. You want to like maybe come to our life group and meet some other, does that make sense? Like just provide them with some opportunities for relationship with people that would address that. That could be a way of speaking to that. A lot of times, the way you address an emotional barrier is to just be like, I'm so sorry, right? That's not what I think Christianity is. Maybe let me try to share with you what I think a better way is, but I want to acknowledge your pain and not invalidate that, right? There is no good answer to, like somebody who was abused, right? In the church by somebody in the church, right? Like there's no set of like answers that you're going to give that address that. Like what you do is you love them and you validate their pain and you believe them, and that is what it actually looks like to do that. I mean, I think about that a lot. Again, with kids and marriage and stuff, navigating trauma. Like, I so want to, because I wanted to say, like, well, what I need to do is, like, help fix this, right? When really the way that you address it is just by being present and listening. Now, there are also times where you'll absolutely have a discussion about, like, God's sovereignty and human freedom with somebody and, and kind of working through that intellectually. That's fine, too. But your goal in that conversation is to address the barrier, and then, if it seems appropriate, to share the gospel. And I say if it seems appropriate because there are certain conversations where you're like, I don't think right now talking through the good news of Jesus, is going to be received super well. But I do think that usually it is a good thing to do, because a danger of this is that, let's say, you asked about science stuff. Let's say that, some guy wants to have a debate with you about evolution, right? I mean, one of the things that's really hard for me, I remember seeing a debate when I was in high school, that they took our youth group to between, two scientists about that was, some big event in Lincoln. And I remember coming out of there and just being like, the guy who is a Christian, right, like made a bunch of clever arguments, and he was kind of a funny guy and stuff, but he never mentioned Jesus or talked about the gospel. And you could have gone to this debate and like never, you wouldn't know anything more about Christianity, right? Like, I mean, and bluntly, just like, because we mentioned it, like deists and Muslims and Hindus all believe in creation too, right? Like, it's not like that somehow makes you a Christian. And so you do want to, generally speaking, try to say, how can I share the gospel of Jesus with someone? We're going to talk concretely about what that can look like in the next session, but that is sort of what it looks like. Is you're saying in this conversation, what seems to be this barrier and how can we kind of talk about it and address it? And then, is it appropriate, which often it's yes, but not always, to kind of speak and share the good news of what Jesus has done? If so, I'm just going to try to find a way to share that or a piece of that. And then you offer to pray. Now, there will be times in that conversation where, if you have that a number of times with people, there would come a point, if the Spirit is working, where that person, the final barrier is removed, and they're like, I want to become a Christian. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But most of the time, what you're doing is helping them take the next step there. Does that make sense to everybody? One other note, I kind of alluded to this, but part of addressing cultural relational barriers especially, and sometimes emotional barriers, does involve helping people engage with the church and other believers, right? Like it's sometimes people become Christians, like say they're following Jesus and then start to engage with the community of faith. More often people are somewhat engaged with the community of faith before they really start following Jesus because those things are in play. So that can also be part of how you address it. But any questions about all of that? Okay. So let's say, though, that you're talking with the person and they're like, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, right? Or they seem to identify as a Christian, or they're like, I'm a Lutheran or a Catholic or a Presbyterian, or, some version of that, right? Now, Don was asking this question, and this is the thing that I'm going to kind of push back against in how we engage with this. I don't know where people's hearts are. Does that make sense? I think about this in terms of funerals a lot of times. They say that there's two kind of funeral sermons you preach as a pastor, right? Which is funeral sermons for people that aren't Christians and funeral sermons for people that are. It's the same sermon. You honor the person's life and proclaim the gospel and the hope of the resurrection. And if they're not a Christian, you don't explicitly connect the two for that person. And if they are a Christian, you do explicitly connect them. But in my experience, the tricky thing, having done a lot of funerals, especially in Illinois, in a community that had just a lot of aging people, I did even for a lot of people outside of the church, a lot of funerals, was that I'm like, there's really three groups. There's people who I am sure weren't Christians because they would have never said they were a Christian, right? And that's a very small group, but I did a few of those funerals. And there's people that like, man, those are wonderful saints, and I know they're following Jesus. Does that make sense? And then there's like this whole middle ground of people that I'm like, I don't know where your heart's at. Like, you don't know for anybody. Does that make sense? But especially for a lot of those people, I'm like, yeah, there's some cool things there. There's some real brokenness there. Like, it's not my place to judge. Does that make sense? And I think that that's just a reality of us interacting with people. And frankly, I think that's normal even in Scripture. And that fits with what we said about the Great Commission. Again, remember that the command is to make disciples, baptizing them, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you, which is to say it's not, make people into Christians. It's kind of walking through this whole process from before they're following Jesus until the day they die, walking as disciples. And so that means just because someone's a Christian, that doesn't mean we're not going to have a spiritual conversation. But it can be a lot trickier for us, I think, to say, well, what are we going to talk about, right? Like, what does it look like to take the next step? And so I'm going to put this chart up here. It's in your notes as well. But this is a helpful rubric to me in terms of just saying, what are the areas that everybody is growing as Christians and as you move towards Christ? I said inward and outward. And that is to say, Jesus says there's two commandments, right? Love God, love your neighbor. Right? Love God, love other people. And both of those things in kind of true discipleship have an internal and an external component to them. I'll explain that in just a minute. But it's just a way of saying, like, at a real basic level, it's obviously more complicated than this. There's actually it's one of my favorite things, which tells you something about me. But there's this book from the late 80s, early 90s by Crusade or InterVarsity guy, but trying to map out all of discipleship, and it has 30 pages of flowcharts trying to lay out all the different areas that people need to grow spiritually. It's completely useless because it's massively overcomplicated, but anyway, there's a lot that people are in. But this is a way of saying, okay, where is there room for you to grow? So internal, and I'm just gonna So the movement is basically this, which will hopefully make sense to you in just a minute, okay? We're sort of this and these two together and then this. So loving God internally means experiencing communion with God. It means the sense, the experienced sense, emotional sense that God loves me, that I'm his child, that he's close to me, right? Does that make sense to you guys? That is the kind of first category. Growth in terms of communion with God can mean a few different things. First of all, because this is the place we start, Don, the kind of question you were asking, this helps speak to, because often people who would say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but it's not really real for, if you start asking them man, like, what's it like, like, what is your experience of God like? It very quickly becomes apparent that that's not a thing they've experienced. Does that make sense? And so part of that is just speaking to them of, like, again, the gospel of Jesus, that God loves us and saved us in Jesus, right? But that's also something that we speak to believers, right? There are people who have followed Jesus for 30 years and are just like, man, God feels really distant to me, or I'm really wrestling with God right now. And that's the same situation where you can have a conversation where you identify, okay, the place that you need kind of help and care and growth and whatever right now seems to be just in terms of your experience of communion with God. So let's talk about that. And that's the thing we'll talk about. Externally, loving God looks like submission to God, meaning obeying him, right? Meaning seeking to live a life that honors him and reflects his values and priorities in the world. I know that submission in our world is kind of a complicated word, but meaning it in the good sense of just like, honoring and following God, doing what he calls us to do. And there's a reason that I'm saying this comes after communion with God. Does that make sense? Asking people to kind of like act out obedience and submission to God without having experienced that internally and having a foundation of that internal kind of communion with God is unhealthy and it breeds hypocrisy. But yeah, there are absolutely times where you're having a conversation with someone who's following Jesus and is making bad decisions in their life, or treating people poorly, and the appropriate next step conversation to have is to say, hey, like, what's up with that? Or how do you process these things, or what does it look like to obey God in this area of your life? The third category, and like I said, in some ways I think these two, like, this has to come first to some extent, but these two can fit together. Loving others internally is about the community of faith, meaning, are you engaged with the church? Are you engaged with some other Christians in ways that they can speak into your life and you can speak into their life? Do you have those kinds of relationships and friendships? So you might be talking to somebody and realize that they seem to really trust in Jesus and they're trying to follow him, but they're disconnected from the community of faith. So you might invite them in. Or you might recognize that the thing that they're struggling with right now is some natural relational issue that arises within the community of faith, right? Like somebody's being a jerk or gossiping about them, or, they felt kind of hurt by something. And so you kind of are speaking to that, and that's the next step for them to take, is to kind of work through that. And then externally, loving others looks like God's mission in the world, which doesn't just mean evangelism, but God is at work in the world, right? Bringing justice, helping the poor and downtrodden, and proclaiming and sharing the good news and hope of the gospel. And so we might be talking to somebody. Now, if this is the conversation you're having, you are, to that earlier question, you are probably pretty sure that this person really from the heart is following Jesus. Does that make sense? Like, it's not, you don't usually have the, like, why don't you volunteer with me at the mission? I mean, maybe you do for other reasons, but, you don't have the, like, you should tell other people about Jesus conversation with somebody if you don't think that they know Jesus personally, right? But it could be that that's kind of the place that they need to grow as a disciple. And I've known people, right, who this is great in a lot of ways, not perfect because we're not perfect, but they're really engaged here, and they really are connected to the church, but they really need to just start serving the people around them. They really need to in some ways, this class is a conversation about that a spiritual conversation about that action step. Does that make sense? Like, albeit a kind of long, complicated one. And so the idea with this is that you're talking to somebody who identifies as a Christian, and you basically just try to say, okay, how do I, as I am talking to them, where do I see an area that they're needing to grow? And usually that's the thing that raises the spiritual conversation, right? Maybe they're talking about, like, struggling with the church or not having a place to fit. Maybe they're talking about some doubt or struggle they have. Maybe they're wrestling with something in their life, right? And you're like, okay, this is what a spiritual conversation looks like. And so you identify that thing, and then you try to just talk it through. And in terms of responding, what I wrote there is one discipleship action step with support, which means that if, assuming it goes well, right? Assuming that, the person seems open and you're wanting to grow together, what you're going to ask them to do, what you're going to try to engage with them to do, is not to fix everything. I think that's one of the traps that we get into. Does that make sense? Like, somebody shares that they're struggling in their marriage. They're a fellow Christian. And we're like, oh, well, so clearly, like, there's some kind of, this somewhere in here about loving or sacrificing for your spouse or something. Like, that's the thing you need to grow. But then what we come out of is a conversation where we say, well, what you need to do is just be a better husband, right? And that's not actually helpful. Does that make sense? So instead, you want to have a conversation that helps identify together, like, here's a specific area that you can grow, or here's a specific practice, and I say with support, because a big part of having that spiritual conversation, or discipleship conversation in this case, is saying, how can I partner with you to do that? Does that make sense? So, like, if someone's like, man, I just don't feel like I don't know how to pray, the thing you should do is not hand them a book about prayer, first and foremost, but it's pray with them. Does that make sense? Maybe even try to weekly just say, hey, could we just sit down and pray together, or something like that, and try to identify a specific way that they can kind of take that next step in discipleship, with support and with your care. And then again, offer to pray for them. So, now let me give the obligatory, all of that, right, is messy in practice in real life, right? I mean, it's not that you don't ever, please, like, pull out this flowchart. You know what I mean? Like, you're not like, oh, here and now this. Does that make sense? I'm not walking through all of that, but that's a way of saying, okay, as you're sitting with someone, as you're talking with them, that's the kind of process you walk through. Is the person in crisis? If yes, then I'm going to listen and care, offer support, where I can, and pray with them. No, they're not. So, okay, does this person seem receptive as we're starting to kind of get into the spiritual conversation? If no, just honor that. But if yes, then I kind of just asking, like, is this person like someone who I think would identify as a Christian? And if they're not, then I'm like, okay, I'm going to just try to start, as we're having this conversation, be asking, like, well, why not? What's the barrier to that? What's the issue? And whatever that one thing is, right, we're going to go ahead and talk through that thing. And next month, if it's some other thing when I'm talking to them, then we'll talk about that thing. And I'll seek to share the gospel in that as I do. Or if they would identify as a Christian, I'm just kind of asking, okay, as we're talking about this, whatever the thing is. And again, a lot of what's hard about this is a given conversation is going to present in a certain way. Does that make sense? Like, if someone's like, I'm really struggling in my marriage, and that's the door open to your conversation, like, sort of the shape of it. Does that make sense? And that's different than something else. But you're just kind of looking for how they can take the next step and talking through that with them in a way that tries to offer support. And in every case, you can offer to pray. So, questions about all of that. That's a lot, I know. And that's where I'm like, man, I told Janae that I have too much content probably. But my hope in doing that is mostly to just demystify it a little bit. Because I think otherwise we can just feel like, what is happening? And that's the way of just saying, like, here's, broadly speaking, some of the conversations that we'll be having as we engage with people about spiritual things and how to think about healthy next step goals rather than trying to, like, force them to convert in a single conversation. I'm going to pause for a minute or two so that people can process. Yeah, Chris.
Kind of a question, kind of not, just like you were talking about how the movement here is top left to bottom right?
To some extent, yeah.
Generally speaking, yeah. And just thinking, like, even though it's a square, it's not a straight line, it's quadrants, that movement is struck me, and just in case it's helpful for others. We have a history at our church with worship, grow, serve, reach, and now worship, grow, serve, share. That is that movement.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's the worship. The worship has to come first. And when you talk about support, wherever someone is in this, like they profess to be a follower, and so you want to offer support, not just in you give them, but also understanding that there's kind of a support that comes from the worship coming first.
Yeah.
The worship has to undergird the external and the submission in the community of faith. And then there really is a worship, and there's a grow and a serve.
Yeah.
And then a reach or a share.
Yep. Yeah.
A couple thoughts. One, I thought maybe we could do the wristbands with the flow chart, like flip it up like football players. It's always readily available. No. Second, like, I was just processing slowly, but I feel like obviously in that flow chart the question of are they receptive? The that's a really important place to just kind of stop and sit with people.
Yeah.
Right? And like, I don't know, I was trying to like think through a lot of situations where I maybe asked that question in different ways, but obviously if everyone else is processing slowly like I was, or if you weren't able to process, like I think that's just a helpful place to sit in the relationships that you have. Like, are they receptive to a spiritual conversation? If so, if not, why?
Yeah.
I think from a summer standpoint, what you presented is laying a very good foundational background of how we earn the right, so to speak, and realize when you have reached a place where you can then go to the next step, which is presenting the gospel.
Yeah.
But this is, I appreciate this. Very good.
But questions about it or pushback if you have. I don't need you to. Yes, thank you, Don, but I'm too Midwestern to want to get praised. Okay. So let's do this then. Let's walk through it. So let's say that you're talking with me, and we don't know each other super well, so that I don't have to give you all these details. And I'm not me, right? I'm just some person that you know. And we're having a conversation, and it starts to kind of skew in a spiritual direction. And, maybe you're like, yeah, like, I mean, let's say that you're just talking about, like, going to church on Sunday. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not, that's not really my thing. That's cool for you, but I'm not a religious person, right? And I say that. Okay, so what's the first thing you ask? Pause. Let's walk through the process, because, sorry, backing up a little. Yes, you're right. That's a good question. But so first you're asking about crisis, right? Because we said, which is to say, if what came before, so you're asking, are there crisis? So you think about what just came before this in conversation. Does that make sense? So if I had said, if the context of this was, I just found out that I have stage 4 cancer. Does that make sense? And you're like, I'm sorry, I'll be praying for you. Is there anything I can do? And I respond with, in that case, what do we do? If that was the context of the conversation.
Let me know if there's something I can do.
Yep. Do some listening. Yep. Say, I'm sorry. Yes. Ask if there's stuff you can do. Pray with the person, right? But let's say instead that wasn't the context. Let's say we were just talking about like our plans for Sunday or something like that, right? So that we know that the first answer to that is no. Then what would be a good, so I make that statement. Then, Hallie, do you want to, what would you kind of, yeah. Sure, that's a good way. You're kind of starting the conversation there, right?
Is this a very tangential way to get to, is this person potentially receptive?
Yep. No, that's totally fair because, yes, it doesn't have to be like, oh, can I talk to you about that, right? So if you said that, what would be an example of someone's response? So you're like, oh, like, do you have a background in the church? Like, where's that coming from? That's kind of what your question was. What would be an example of a response where you would say, this person is not receptive? No, we'll get there. But so let's say we ask kind of Hallie's, yeah.
If someone said, basically I'm atheist, I don't believe in God, like, just think religion's a whole crap hooey,
Yeah.
that'd be very non-receptive. If someone was like, oh yeah, I grew up going to church and had this terrible pastor who did this bad
Right.
thing, and then they kind of go on a much more emotional
It is.
funnels more easily into, oh, we've
Yep.
got barriers that are pretty addressable.
Although, interestingly, I'm not sure that your first example means they're not receptive. In my mind, the most non-receptive response for someone, let's say that you ask that question, is like, oh, it's just not for me. Does that make sense? Because kind of uncaring, I think, often is the biggest sign of receptivity. Interestingly, because I have some friends who, at different points have been very hostile to, to Christian faith in the oh, I'm an atheist and I think it's all bunk way. But usually those people are very interested and open to having conversations, right? Because the very fact that they're passionate about it, even though they're passionately opposed, sort of invites a good, as long as you give them a safe and healthy relationship and aren't mean to them or something, they'll often actually really appreciate the chance to talk. But I like that. I like that response because that's much more like how it would be in an actual conversation and not, oh, well, can I talk to you about that? Which is, more forced. Okay. But so let's say they give some response where they're just where they're like, no, I've never really been, a church-going person. My parents didn't really go to church, something like that. Let's say that that's how they answer your question. But they're like, yeah, so, but it's enough that you think, okay, this person is receptive. So then, what's the next question?
I would say, I'm still getting back to what she says.
Yeah.
I think it's a good place for kind of a personal testimony type thing
Mm-hmm.
to develop a level of empathy to show you're really listening to what this person had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then in developing that empathy, you're asking permission to share with them
Mm-hmm.
whether or not you really understand what they're telling you about their situation.
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, these aren't right and wrong. Does that make sense? That's good. Just to clarify first, technically the next question, because I'm trying to just walk us through it, is this person a follower of Jesus? Do they identify as a follower of Jesus? But we already have the answer. And that's part of why I'm using this example is because it's not always, you get there and you're like, oh, no, we're having this conversation. So, it could be that sharing a testimony is great. We don't have a lot of conversation. It could be other ways to address it. But what's the next step? What are we trying to figure out then? Yes, so what is the barrier then? What's the thing? So what would be some ways that we could ask and engage with that to try to find that out?
Yeah, you said church wasn't for you. I mean, what's your experience?
Yeah. So that would.
What wasn't for you? What didn't you?
Yep. So you could ask that, or another way to address it, especially if it doesn't seem like they've been connected, would be to say are you interested in engaging with the church? Why not? What's the thing that's keeping you from trying that out, or something like that, right? Or frankly, this is what happens when I role play a conversation in real time. If I was having this conversation, I might just be like, you want to come with me on Sunday and check it out and see, what about that? And that doesn't mean, but they might say well, no, and then you can press that's cool. You totally don't have to. I'm just curious, why not? Are there things that you don't like about the idea or something like that? But yeah, you're probing at that question, right? Of why not? What are a couple of different examples I know I'm making you play both sides of this conversation, but what are a couple of different examples that there might be of barriers for that person that we're kind of imagining having this conversation? Sure. Well, yeah, so it could be political stuff, right? It could be oh, the church is so political, whatever. It could totally just, yeah. Did you say control for the other thing?
I think cultural.
Oh, cultural. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that, that's the thing I too often assume
Mm-hmm.
that someone I'm talking to is it'll be a stumbling block that they're trending towards modern American values, and that how do I, it feels like
Mm-hmm.
that's the way to talk about Jesus. I don't know.
Yeah. I will also just say that there's a balance to be found there. This is not where we are in the role play, but I think this is a thing that's in the background for a lot of people. There's a balance to be found there between when you're answering and addressing kind of cultural objections or intellectual issues or whatever, you don't lie to people about what Christianity says, but you also recognize that like Christian ethics exists within the context of gospel grace in a loving community. Does that make sense? And so there's a real tension there. So let me just name, like, the boogeyman for a lot of people today is LGBTQ discussions, right? And part of what's hard, of course, is that, like, is that I want to be biblically faithful while also being nuanced in a way that some biblically faithful people aren't, right? Does that make sense? The sort of, like, God hates, the kids are here. But, yeah, like, you have that kind of burden. But there's a tension in every issue. That's just a cultural hot button right now. Because on the one hand, you don't want to lie to people that there's some hard things that Christianity, teaches about that stuff for them potentially, especially if they're gay or bisexual or, or queer or something. That there's going to be some challenging things there. But you don't want to communicate to them that they have to sort of agree, figure all of that out right now before they can kind of like wrestle with Jesus. Does that make sense? Like what you really want to be having is a conversation about Jesus. And there is a real tension, because what happens is, on the one hand, some Christians want to approach it basically to say, like, you need to agree with Christian sexual ethics, say, before you can really, start to follow Jesus. And that's not necessarily biblical, right? There are lots of people that are kind of drawn into the Christian life and wrestle and don't have it all figured out, right? I mean, you have... even within the context of sex and sexuality, for example, the way that polygamy functions in the Old Testament, and these figures that are, So, like, you want to say, like, you can start to process this stuff and engage while you're still in a place that, that's sinful. But on the other hand, there are some people that I think, or that want to just say, like, we're going to remove any sort of challenge to you in a way that says, like, oh no, like, just, you'll never have to worry about that. And that can really set people up for hard things too. I actually remember, I had a lot of friends in the LGBT community in St. Louis, and it was a weird set of friendships, but but I remember one of them expressing to me getting really burned by the church because they were kind of invited into this church and started going and had gone for 2 years. This was a married gay couple, right? And wanted to become members, and were told that they can't become members because, this doesn't fit with the Bible. And they were just like, why didn't this conversation happen earlier? Does that make sense? Like, there's a way of being so welcoming and so, like, that then can set that up. So anyway, there's a real tension that I want to name there when you're dealing with people. But I think that that's true, but I think we should default within a given spiritual conversation to the position that kind of says, like, man, can we, like, talk about Jesus and stuff like that first? Does that make sense? Because I think that if we don't do that, then we're often failing to have the kind of gospel kind of play that role. I just wanted to address that, because I know that's in the background for a lot of people. And again, part of what's hard is that there's so much complexity there that I feel. But I wouldn't let that keep you from having that conversation with somebody, because there is also space to just say, like, hey, like, let's try to talk about Jesus in this moment, right? I mean, even if I'm afraid to engage with those other issues. Sorry, I feel like that was a meandering sort of response to you, Anne, and sort of reflection on some of the tensions in those things. Does anyone have questions about that, or we can go back to broader questions? Yeah.
Maybe I'm coming up with a little pushback on that.
Yeah, that's great.
I think the build relationships, identify barriers, box, this can be like a decade-long process.
Yes.
Like when I think about, I'm just thinking of some friends I've had for years and years, and I know like what some of the barriers are.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had some semi-serious conversations over the years that I don't feel like we yet have gotten as far. But anyways, like, I just think that process, I think, is a challenge. So this is just, I think, a challenge in the Christian faith and sharing the gospel is if you're in build relationship mode, I feel like you kind of just need to be in build relationship mode, not in I'm going to build relationship mode
Sure.
then I can effectively knock down those barriers
Mhm.
and, open the door. It doesn't really work. And I think of those people that I've been friends with for a long time, I hope someday
Yeah.
that might be a thing. I see little sparks of it sometimes, and it's like, maybe.
Mhm.
I think part of the reason our friendship has even continued for as long as it has, despite variable chasms in belief systems of
Yeah.
all things political and religious, is because there's never an agenda.
Mhm.
And so I don't know how to gauge that. Like, how do you be intentional about sharing the gospel and things like that, but also kind of keep the agenda out of it that allows for the relationship to flourish, for one. And two, I always get the sense if someone's going to become a Christian when anybody shares the gospel, it's not because, it's very rarely because we've just effectively addressed all of their concerns.
Yes.
Like, almost never is it like the person's like, oh, I've got all my boxes checked, now I become a Christian. Much more, there's some other just Holy Spirit switch.
Mhm.
And not that we shouldn't try to address concerns, but that's something I'm just contemplating and thinking, like, I have a friend who has a long list of boxes.
Yeah.
And I think someone more skilled than I, who understands all arguments, could check all his boxes and give him all his reasons that he wouldn't
Let me
become a Christian. He wouldn't be like,
Yeah.
boxes checked.
let me make a couple of points there. Is that okay? Because that was expansive. No. And I don't disagree with that, but I also have a little bit of tension. So one, it is unquestionably true that ultimately all of this exists within the context of the Holy Spirit working and all of that stuff. Part of why this is kind of like an extension of the sermon series, right, is because there's a lot of background things there about God being on a mission and stuff like that. You're not changing people's hearts, any of that stuff. Like, this is very much God ordinarily works through ordinary means, right? And like the ordinary way that people hear about Jesus is through someone proclaiming him, the ordinary way that, and so we're trying to have conversations about like how we can kind of play that role, do some of that without, without it becoming that. Two, so relationships shouldn't have an agenda with a kind of asterisk. Let me, what I think you're right about in saying that, and what I very much agree with, is that like people are valuable because they're image bearers of God, they're interesting and endlessly diverse, and so like, yeah, and I have friends that aren't Christians, and and that people that I love that they don't follow Jesus, and they follow Jesus, and I have very different ideas about things with, right? It's not like this is the only inflection point, in a relationship, right? And it is good and important to value those relationships. But at the same time, I do think there's a sort of, like, here's what I really want, is that, like, there's a sort of way of doing relationships where things never come up. Does that make sense? And we kind of never nudge. We never kind of open the door. We just kind of let them go. And what I really want to do is create some friction for that. Does that make sense? Because the analogy that's in my head right now, and this, I don't know if this is a good analogy now, but if I have a friend who's just really physically unhealthy, does that make sense? Like they smoke 3 packs a day and are 300 pounds and never, you know what I mean? They're just really physically unhealthy. It is not serving them to just sort of harp on them and try to get them to change. Does that make sense? Like, and it doesn't mean that I can't really enjoy their friendship and value them and appreciate that they're great people. But I do have a sense that that this thing would be good for them if it changed in their life. And it's the sort of thing that it is appropriate for me to kind of have that friction with. Does that make sense? Because it's not good for them if I just never address it. And yeah, does that make sense? As sort of an image? And I feel like sort of something like that is how I want to feel, and about people that I walk with that aren't Christians, because I don't want to settle into a rhythm where I'm just never going to address that stuff, never kind of push, never create any of that, kind of tension. But neither do I want that to be the thing that, if it doesn't change, destroys our friendship, right? Because it's not good for me to be like, well, until you lose 100 pounds, we're not going to hang out, or something like that, right? Or like every time we meet to just be like, well, have you stopped smoking yet? Have you, that's not how people change. That's not helpful to the relationship. And that's, I think, the tension is that I mean, the category that people use is relational evangelism, right? You know, to talk about all those, like, you're just in relationship and friends, have friendships with people, and then you kind of share Jesus through that. And the good side of that is that that's right on some fundamental level, and you need those relationships, and you need to value people and love people. The downside is that, like, there is, it can very easily just become relational, you know, and the evangelism doesn't ever happen. Does that make sense? The sharing, the having those conversations doesn't ever happen. And I guess that's kind of in the background of it. One other note on that is that I think identifying barriers is maybe a little trickier than just having the checklist of, like, objections that they have to the Christian faith. Usually when somebody has a list of kind of intellectual objections to the Christian faith, those are real, and you don't want to discredit those, but there are also emotional, cultural, relational, spiritual things going on in the background of that. Does that make sense? Like, I shouldn't tell this story because this is not, but I have a friend who is an RUF campus minister who once jokingly said that every semester he has one or two kids from RUF is a campus, you know, a college ministry, come in and say, I've got these, like, objections that I need to deal with to the Christian faith, and they give this long list of, like, reliability of scripture, you know, like arguments for God things. And what he said, what I always want to ask them is, how many months ago did you start sleeping with your girlfriend? Which is not to say that, like, he was being facetious, and obviously it's not that simple. Does that make sense? But, like, oftentimes, like, that, like, for a college student, you know, they're kind of like, I don't want to follow Jesus in this area of life, and then suddenly they start kind of raising those things. Now, it's not, again, I don't mean that dismissively of those kind of struggles, or even of those college kids, because it's a real struggle, but I do think that there's that reality that just says, like, there's often other things in play, and often if we're kind of running in circles around the same intellectual things, that just makes me think, maybe, like, the real things we need to be talking about are something else. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, I mean, I remember a friend that I had years ago who we were having a conversation about, like, he was an anarchist, and I used to be an anarcho-communist. But anyway, this was me at, like, 19, right? And so he was a fellow anarchist and was objecting to Christianity because it perpetuated authority structures in the world. And just in passing, mentioned, like, a youth worker touching him. I just rolled on. I just remember being like, whoa, hold on a minute. Like, I don't think we need to be, you know, like I think there's this other really, like, hard conversation that we need to have that isn't, you know, I mean, because there's this heartbreaking, like, emotional thing that's in play for you, that's what matters, right? Like, the intellectual stuff. Yeah. Anyway, all of that is to say, maybe also I think I feel some of that. Sorry. Does that answer some of your tension? I want to honor that, though, because, like, there is, like, none of this means that people should be on a flow chart in our projects and you just are trying to get them from, yeah.
I think in particular what you mentioned about creating sort of the friction necessary to sometimes make ourselves say the moderately uncomfortable thing.
Yeah.
That's a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Anne?
I think that when the difference between agenda, right, like this checklist or whatever, is that concern, right, with that picture of that friend who you're like, I love you, so I really wish you would stop smoking 3 packs a day. And like I connect that to, like, I have these neighbors and I feel so guilty that I should be sharing the gospel or, you know, making these moments. But that's coming more from this, like, legalistic
Well, also, you are an amazing person, right? And I like see that amazingness in you and want you to flourish, as a person. Yeah. Yeah. Let me give you one last thought, and then we'll go eat here about all of that. And this was, in some ways, to speak to some of that tension too, which is that all of that said, like life isn't a flowchart, right? And I put that there largely. I had us walk through all of that largely because I think without sort of like having some foundational sense of some of those categories and things you can talk about, you just feel like you're in the ocean, right? And you can be like, where do I start with this? But one of my favorite stories about like how sharing the gospel with people works in the real world is, so I was in college. After my freshman year at college, I went on this summer training program with the campus ministry that I then quit immediately after, shortly after the summer training program. It was a good ministry, but there was just, that's a long story. But they made us do beach evangelism every weekend, where you went out and had to share the bridge illustration with people on the beach. And I had several weird interactions. There was one guy who I'm pretty sure was a Catholic priest who was sitting out on the beach and wanted to talk with us about like Jesus being present in suffering and all of this stuff that actually like I've looked back on years later and I'm like, man, he had like, this was a guy who clearly like had all this wisdom and spiritual insight. And I was like, but can I draw the bridge illustration in the sand for you? Anyway, but the story I remember the most from those outings, which I hated, like it was not for me. And I hated it because I felt like we were all just like trying to engineer these encounters that we could come back and then tell each other about to feel like we were all good Christians. But I and another guy who was also really struggling that summer, we ended up being paired together and we went out and we're just like, we just can't do this. We just like walked around the beach and we're like, we're just going to walk around and pray for a while because like we can't do this anymore. This was like week 5 or 6 or something. I'm looking at Brad because he was there. He wasn't the guy I went out with, and I don't think had quite as hard of a time of it as I did. But so we're walking around praying and just wrestling, and these 2 drunk homeless guys start yelling at us. And they're like, "Hey," and so we walk over there. They've got like their 40s of malt liquor in their, their paper bags, and we're like, and so anyway, so we're looking at each other and we're like, we don't really want to do this, but like, surely this is the Holy Spirit, right? Like, well, let's go over and we'll like share the gospel with these guys. And we walk over. And the guy, this very red-eyed drunk homeless guy looks at me and this other guy named Ryan, and he's like, "Do you guys know Jesus as your personal savior?" And he proceeds for the next 20 minutes to give us a gospel presentation and like, invite us to follow Jesus and stuff like that. And it was one of those encounters that I've never known quite what to make of, right? I understand all the complexities of substance abuse and mental illness and stuff. But I just remember that as just a reminder of like, man, like whatever your framework is for what you expect to go out and do, there is also that reality of just like God moves in those ways that don't fit that framework, and it is important to be open to that. So as much as that flowchart is true, I just wanted to share that story as a way of saying like also just be open to the Spirit even as you're having those conversations, because sometimes it's something really different. Let me pray for us and then we'll go eat. Father, thank you so much for this chance we have to talk through these things and for the hearts of these friends here. And I just pray that you would be working through us to share the hope of Jesus with others. Bless this meal now and bless us this afternoon as we finish up the class. Pray this all in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.